How I'm Partly to Blame for Mass Immigration by Peter Hitchens, published in 2013 in the Mail on Sunday, read by Melanie Bennett in 2024. Was this Britain? Every group of people I passed was speaking Russian. The shops were full of black bread, pickled cucumbers and vodka, and the faces were Slavic. The advertisements in the window were in Cyrillic script, and I'd come to know so well when I lived many years before in Moscow. Yet here I was, in the shadow of a lovely English Gothic church tower, halfway to dear old Skegness, surrounded by fields of English turnips, leeks, and sugar beet, under an English heaven. This was Boston, Lincolnshire, which I'd first seen 3 decades ago as a somnolent, slightly shabby market town where a kindly traffic warden had found me a parking space saying, "We can always find room for a foreigner." In those days, a visitor from London was about as foreign as it got in Boston. Now, they were talking Portuguese in the pubs, Polish in the cafes, Latvian and Estonian on the buses. If I'd fallen into the river and called out help, I couldn't even have been sure that anyone would have understood. Somehow, this transformation was more of a shock, more disturbing and perplexing than any of the other migration-driven changes I'd seen. And that tended to be the attitude of the older residents. Not anger, hatred, or hostility. We're not like that. But bafflement that such a huge thing could have erupted into their peaceful lives without anyone warning or asking them. We'd all got used to London being different, long ago. The former mill towns of Yorkshire and Lancashire, with their huge new mosques and veiled women, were a place apart. But Lincolnshire? If it could come here into deep England, then it would come everywhere. It's really not much good, the Prime Minister, turning around now and saying to the people of Boston, this must stop. Even if anyone believed that he or anyone will do anything, and his various schemes are as firmly based as Theresa May's promise to get rid of Abu Qatada, the event has happened. The greatest mass migration in our history has taken place. The newcomers are lawfully here. They have jobs. They live in houses. They use the NHS. Their children are in schools. Come to that, they pay tax. Our leaders only had to go to Boston any time in the past 5 years, and they would have known. But all our leading politicians were afraid of knowing the truth. If they knew, they would at least have to pretend to act. And the truth was, they liked things as they were. And it was at least partly my own fault. When I was a revolutionary Marxist, we were all in favor of as much immigration as possible. It wasn't because we liked immigrants, but because we didn't like Britain. We saw immigrants from anywhere as allies against the stead, settled, conservative society that our country still was at the end of the 60s. If they dared to express the mildest objection, we called them bigots. Revolutionary students didn't come from such vibrant areas. We came, as far as I could tell, mostly from Surrey and nicer parts of London. We might live in vibrant places for a few, usually squalid years, amid unmown lawns and overflowing dustbins. But we did so as irresponsible, childless transients, not as homeowners or parents of school-aged children, or as old people hoping for a bit of serenity at the end of our lives. When we graduated and began to earn serious money, we generally headed for expensive London enclaves and became extremely choosy about where our children went to school, a choice we happily denied the urban poor, the ones we sneered at as racist. What did we know or care of the great silent revolution which even then was beginning to transform the lives of the British poor? To us, it meant patriotism and tradition could always be derided as racist. And it also meant cheap servants for the rich and new middle class for the first time since 1939, as well as cheap restaurants and, later on, cheap builders and plumbers working off the books. It wasn't our wages that were depressed or our work that was priced out of the market. Immigrants didn't do the sorts of jobs we did. They were no threat to us. The only threat might have come from the aggrieved British people, but we could always stifle their protests by suggesting that they were modern-day fascists. I have since learned what a spiteful, self-righteous, snobbish, and arrogant person I was, and most of my revolutionary comrades were too. I have seen places that I knew and felt at home in change completely in a few short years. I have imagined what it might be like to have grown old while stranded in a shabby, narrow street where my neighbors spoke a very different language, and I gradually found myself becoming a lonely, shaky-voiced stranger in a world I once knew, but which no longer knew me. I have felt deeply, hopelessly sorry that I did and said nothing in defense of those whose lives were turned upside down without their ever being asked, and who were warned very clearly that, if they complained, they would be despised outcasts. And I have spent a great deal of time in parts of Britain where the revolutionary unintelligentsia don't go. Such people seldom, if ever, visit their own country. Their orbits are in fashionable London zones and holiday destinations. They're better acquainted with the Apennines of Italy than with the Pennines of their own country. But, unlike me, most of the 60s generation still hold the views that I used to hold, and, with recent honorable exceptions of David Goodhart, the left-wing journalist turned think tank boss who recognizes he was wrong, they will not change. The worst part of this is the deep, deep hypocrisy of it. Even back in my Trotskyist days, I'd begun to notice that many of the migrants from Asia were in fact not our allies. They were deeply, unshakably religious. They were socially conservative. Their attitudes towards girls and women were in many cases close to medieval. Many of them were horribly hostile to Jews in a way which we could have condemned fiercely if anyone else had expressed it, but which we somehow managed to forgive and forget in their case. We've recently seen this in the distressing and embarrassing episode of Lord Ahmed's outburst against a phantom Jewish conspiracy. But I recall 10 years ago, in a Muslim bookshop in the back streets of Burnley, seeing an open display, a modern edition of Henry Ford's revolting anti-Jewish diatribe, The International Jew, long disowned by Ford himself. It's unthinkable that any mainstream shop in any high street could sell this toxic tripe. Many of these new arrivals, though we revolutionary welcomed them, knew and cared nothing of the great liberal causes we all supported, or they were even hostile to them. Many of the left still lie to themselves about this. George Galloway, the most left-wing MP in Parliament, owes his seat to the support of conservative Muslims. Yet, he voted in favor of same-sex marriage. It would be interesting to be at any meeting where Mr. Galloway discusses this with his constituents. Of course, all political parties are compromised, but there's a big difference between splitting the difference and flatly ignoring a profound clash of principles. This sort of cynicism has been at the heart of the deal. Immigrants have been used by those who wanted to transform the country. They've taken the parts of them they liked and made much of them. They have ignored the parts they did not like. Mr. Galloway likes the Muslims' opposition to the Iraq War and their scorn for New Labour, and good luck to him. But he does not like their views on sexual morality. The same is true for many others. One of the most striking characteristics of the majority of migrants from the Caribbean is their strong, unashamed Christian faith and their love of disciplined education. Yet the arrival of many such people in London was never used as a reason to say that our society should become more Christian or schools should be better ordered. At the time, the revolutionary liberals were hoping to wave goodbye to the church, and they were busy driving discipline out of state schools. So nobody ever said, let us adapt our society to the demands of these newcomers. They had the wrong sort of demands. Instead, the authorities made much of the behavior of a minority of such migrants, often much disliked by their fellow Afro-Caribbean men, who took and sold illegal drugs and were not prepared to respect British law. If proper policing of such people could be classified as racist, then the drug laws as a whole could be weakened and the police placed under liberal control. This is why the so-called Brixton riots of April 1981 were used as a lever to weaken the police and undermine the drug laws, rather than a reason to restore proper law and peace to that part of London. Something very similar happened with the Macpherson report into the murder of Stephen Lawrence. Few noticed that the report openly urged that people from different ethnic groups should be policed in different ways, and actually condemned colorblind policing. In whose interest was this? And wasn't this attitude that different types of behavior could be expected from different ethnic groups racially prejudiced? But what did it matter if it suited the revolutionary liberal agenda of purging the police of old-fashioned conservative types? The same forces destroyed Ray Honeyford, a Bradford headmaster who, long before it was fashionable, tried to stand up against political correctness in school. He was driven from his job and, of course, condemned as a racist. Yet, it would have been very much in the interest of integration and real equality in Bradford if his warnings had been heeded and acted upon. As it is, any observant visitor finds Bradford's Muslim citizens and its non-Muslim citizens live in two separate solitudes, barely in contact with each other. Much of the Islamic community is profoundly out of step with modern Britain. Once again, revolutionary liberals had formed a cynical alliance to destroy conservative opposition. Their greatest ally was, and has always been, the Tory politician Enoch Powell, who, in a stupid and cynical speech in 1968, packed with alarmist language and sprinkled with derogatory expressions and inflammatory rumour, defined debate on the subject of immigration for 40 years. Thanks to him and his undoubted attempt to mobilize racial hostility, the revolutionary liberals have ever afterward found it easy to accuse any opponent of being a Powellite. Absurdly, even when Britain's frontiers were demolished by Blair government and hundreds of thousands of white-skinned Europeans came here to work, it was still possible to smear any doubters as racist. It couldn't have been more obvious that race wasn't the problem. The thing that made these new residents different was culture, language, customs, attitude, sense of humor. Rather than them adapting to our way of life, we were adapting to theirs. This wasn't integration, it was a revolution. Yet nobody, especially their elected representatives, would listen to them, because they were assumed to be Powellite bigots, motivated by some sort of unreasoned hatred. Now, I believe that the unreasoned hatred comes almost entirely from the liberal left. Of course, there are still people who harbored stupid racial prejudices, but most of those concerned about immigration are completely innocent of such feelings. The screaming, spitting intolerance comes from a pampered elite who are ashamed of their own country, despise patriotism in others, and feel none themselves. They long for a horrible, borderless utopia in which love of country has vanished, nannies are cheap, and other people's wages are low. What a pity it is that there seems to be no way of turning these people out of their positions of power and influence. For if there is to be any hope of harmony on these islands, then it can only come through a great effort to bring us all together, once again, in a shared love for this, the most beautiful and blessed plot of earth on the planet.